Good evening, friends. Tonight, we're going to drift slowly into a story that unfolds across frozen lakes, snow-covered plains, and the quiet resilience of people who saw winter not as an enemy, but as a teacher. Where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it in your part of the world? Wherever you are, I invite you to dim your lights, rest your head gently on your pillow, and allow your breathing to soften. Let the weight of the day dissolve as we step together into a world where ice and silence were companions, where survival was woven with patience, and where the coldest months brought not fear, but a deep, quiet understanding. If this peaceful journey helps you unwind, feel free to like and subscribe only if it feels right to you. Now close your eyes and let the story begin. Let me share with you a moment from long ago, when the first frost arrived not with dread, but with anticipation. Imagine standing at the edge of a forest in what we now call the Great Lakes region, somewhere around the year 1200. The air is crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. The sky overhead is pale gray, heavy with the promise of snow. You can feel it in your bones, that subtle shift in the atmosphere that tells you winter is near. For the Anishinaabe people, this moment was not one of panic or preparation in the frantic sense we might know today. Instead, it was a signal, a gentle nudge from the world itself, reminding them to shift their rhythm, to listen more closely, to move with the season rather than against it. There's something comforting about this part of the story, the way entire communities would gather in the evenings as the temperature dropped, sharing bowls of warm stew made from wild rice and venison. The rice, harvested in late summer, had been dried and stored in birch bark containers. It had a nutty, earthy flavor, almost like a distant cousin of the wild mushrooms that grew in those same forests. The venison, slow-cooked with juniper berries and a touch of maple syrup, filled the lodges with a scent that made everyone pause, breathe deeply, and feel grateful. If you've ever had a bowl of something warm on a cold night, you know that feeling, that sense of being held by the simplest of comforts. As the snow began to fall, the elders would speak softly about the different kinds of snow. Yes, different kinds. To us, snow might seem like snow, a blanket of white that covers everything in the same way. But to the people who lived with it, who moved through it, who built their homes and planned their hunts around it, snow was a language. There was the dry, powdery snow that came early in the season, light and easy to brush away, perfect for tracking animals because it held their prints clearly. Then there was the wet, heavy snow that arrived later, clinging to branches and building up in drifts, the kind that required snowshoes and patience. There was the crusty snow that formed after a thaw and refreeze, hard enough to walk on without sinking, a gift for travelers. And there was the soft, fresh snow that fell in silence, muffling the world, wrapping the forests in a kind of hush that felt almost sacred. The Inuit peoples of the far north took this understanding even further. In their language, there were dozens of words for snow and ice, each describing a specific condition, a specific texture, a specific way the world presented itself. It's surprising how such a small detail, the naming of snow, shaped an entire way of life. When you can describe the exact quality of the ice on a river, you know whether it's safe to cross. When you can name the kind of snow falling from the sky, you know whether to stay inside or venture out. This wasn't poetry for the sake of beauty, though it was beautiful. This was survival, knowledge passed down through generations, encoded in language itself. Around the year 1400, in the regions we now call the northern plains and the subarctic forests, winter lasted 6, 7, sometimes 8 months. That's more than half the year wrapped in cold, in darkness, in the challenge of finding food and staying warm. And yet, the people who lived there thrived. They didn't just survive, they thrived. They raised children who grew strong, they told stories that lasted centuries, they created art and tools and songs that still echo today. The answer lies not in some grand technological leap, but in something quieter, something we might call acceptance. Not the passive kind of acceptance that means giving up, but the active kind, the kind that means paying attention, adapting, and finding peace in what cannot be changed. Let me tell you about a snack that might seem unusual to us now. In the winter months, when fresh food was scarce, the Lakota people would sometimes eat pemmican, a mixture of dried meat, rendered fat, and dried berries, all pounded together into a dense, energy-rich cake. It could last for months, even years, without spoiling. The berries, often chokecherries or buffalo berries, added a slight tartness that cut through the richness of the fat. It wasn't exactly a delicacy in the way we think of fancy foods today, but it was deeply satisfying, a little sweet, a little savory, and packed with everything the body needed to keep moving through the cold. Pemmican was invented out of necessity, but it became something more, a symbol of ingenuity, of making the most of what the land provided. As the fire crackles softly beside you, imagine sitting in a wigwam, the walls made of bent saplings and covered with layers of birch bark and hides. Outside, the wind whispers through the trees, but inside, it's warm. Not hot, not the kind of warmth that makes you sweat, but a gentle, even warmth that seeps into your skin and makes you want to close your eyes. The smoke from the fire rises slowly, escaping through a small opening at the top of the structure. It smells faintly of cedar, of burning wood, of something ancient and grounding. Children are already asleep, bundled in furs, their breathing soft and steady. The adults speak quietly, their voices low, telling stories or discussing the next day's plans. There's no rush. There's nowhere to be but here. One of the elders, a woman with silver hair and hands worn smooth from decades of work, begins to speak. She talks about the year she was born, sometime around 1350, when her grandmother taught her how to read the sky. Not in the way we might check a weather app today, but in the way you learn to notice patterns, the way clouds move, the color of the sunset, the behavior of the birds. She learned that when the chickadees sang in a certain way, snow was coming. When the deer moved closer to the village, a hard freeze was near. When the northern lights danced especially bright, the elders said the spirits were restless, and it was wise to stay close to home. These weren't superstitions, though they were wrapped in spiritual language. They were observations, accumulated over generations, refined into a system that worked. You might find this little detail soothingly interesting. The concept of winter as a time of rest, of going inward, of slowing down, was not unique to Native American tribes. Cultures around the world have recognized this rhythm. But what sets these tribes apart is the depth of their integration with the season. Winter was not an interruption of life, it was part of the cycle. Just as summer brought growth and abundance, winter brought reflection and endurance. The stories told in winter were different from the stories told in summer. They were longer, more intricate, meant to be savored over many nights. They taught lessons about patience, about cooperation, about the consequences of arrogance or greed. They were entertainment, yes, but they were also education, a way of passing down values and knowledge without the need for writing. In the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which formed around the year 1450 in what is now upstate New York, winter was a time for council meetings and decision-making. The longhouses, massive structures that could hold dozens of families, became centers of community life. People would gather to discuss matters of governance, to resolve disputes, to plan for the seasons ahead. The longhouses were built to withstand the cold, with layers of elm bark providing insulation and central fires running the length of the structure. The warmth was shared, the food was shared, the responsibility was shared. No one was left out in the cold, literally or figuratively. As your body relaxes deeper, let the story carry you onward. Picture yourself walking through a snowy forest at dusk. The sun has already set, but the snow itself seems to glow, reflecting the last hints of light from the sky. Your footsteps crunch softly, the only sound in a world that feels hushed and holy. You're not alone. Ahead of you, a group of travelers moves steadily, their snowshoes leaving wide, webbed prints in the snow. They're heading back to their village after a successful hunt. On their backs, wrapped in hide bundles, are pieces of elk and rabbit, enough to feed several families for days. They're tired, but their tiredness is the good kind, the kind that comes from work well done, from bodies used and muscles stretched. They're looking forward to the warmth of the fire, the taste of roasted meat, the sound of children laughing. They're looking forward to home. And now, allow your mind to float gently into the next chapter. There's a certain magic in the way a shelter can transform cold into comfort. Tonight, let me take you deeper into the structures that made survival possible, the homes and havens that allowed people to not just endure winter, but to live fully within it. Imagine for a moment that you're standing outside a teepee on the northern plains, somewhere around the year 1500. It's early evening, and the temperature has dropped well below freezing. The wind sweeps across the open grassland, carrying with it tiny crystals of ice that sting your cheeks. But inside that teepee, behind those carefully arranged buffalo hides, life is warm and calm. The teepee, which might look simple from the outside, is actually a marvel of engineering. The conical shape isn't arbitrary. It's designed to shed wind and snow, to channel smoke upward through the opening at the top, and to create a stable structure that can withstand the fiercest storms. The hides are placed in overlapping layers, each one treated with a mixture of animal fat and brains to make it waterproof and supple. Yes, brains. It might sound odd to us now, but tanning hides with brains was common across many cultures because it worked beautifully. The resulting leather was soft, durable, and highly insulating. In the coldest months, an inner lining of hides would be added, creating a pocket of air between the two layers, much like modern insulation. This simple innovation could raise the interior temperature by 10, even 20 degrees. Let me share with you what it felt like inside. Picture yourself sitting on a bed of dried grasses covered with soft furs. The floor near the edges of the teepee is cold, but the center, where the fire burns low and steady, is wonderfully warm. The fire itself is small, no roaring blaze, just enough to provide heat and light without filling the space with smoke. Above it, suspended from the lodge poles, is a pot made of clay or carved wood, filled with a stew that's been simmering for hours. The smell is rich and earthy, a blend of wild onions, dried corn, and chunks of buffalo meat. The corn, harvested months ago and dried in the sun, has a slightly sweet flavor that balances the savory richness of the meat. If you've ever had a bowl of stew that seemed to warm you from the inside out, you know what I'm talking about. This wasn't just food, it was medicine, it was love, it was the taste of home. In the southwestern regions, where tribes like the ancestral Puebloans and the Hopi lived, the architecture took a different form but served the same purpose. These communities built their homes into the sides of cliffs or constructed multi-story adobe structures that could house entire villages. The walls, made of mud bricks dried in the sun, were thick, sometimes 2 feet or more. During the day, the adobe absorbed heat from the sun. At night, as the desert air turned bitterly cold, those walls released that stored warmth slowly, keeping the interiors comfortable. It's surprising how such a small principle, thermal mass, shaped an entire architectural tradition that still influences building design today. Inside one of these pueblos, around the year 1300, you might find a family gathered around a small hearth, baking cornbread on a flat stone. The bread, made from blue corn and mixed with ash to make the nutrients more available, would emerge with a slightly smoky flavor and a texture that was both dense and satisfying. They might also have a small bowl of roasted pine nuts, gathered from the forests higher in the mountains, each one rich and buttery, a tiny burst of flavor that felt like a luxury in the middle of winter. Pine nuts were labor-intensive to harvest, requiring patience and careful work, but they were worth it. They were packed with protein and fat, essential for staying strong through the cold months. The Inuit people of the Arctic took the concept of insulation even further with their construction of igloos. Yes, houses made of snow. It sounds impossible, doesn't it? Building shelter from the very thing you're trying to escape. But snow, when packed and shaped correctly, is an excellent insulator. The air trapped within the snow crystals creates tiny pockets that resist heat transfer. An igloo, properly constructed, could maintain an interior temperature of 30 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the outside air, even when the outside temperature was 50 below zero. That's the difference between life and death. Let me walk you through the process, slowly so you can picture it clearly. First, you find snow that has the right consistency, not too soft, not too hard, but firm enough to cut into blocks. You use a long knife made of bone or metal, and you cut rectangular blocks, each one about 2 feet long, 1 foot wide, and 6 inches thick. You start building in a spiral, placing the first blocks in a circle and then gradually tilting each successive layer inward, creating a dome. The last block, the keystone, is placed from the inside, locking the entire structure together. Then, you pack loose snow into the gaps between the blocks, sealing the igloo against the wind. Inside, You dig a small pit for cold air to sink into, and you build a raised platform for sleeping, keeping you above the coldest zone. Finally, you carve a small tunnel entrance, low to the ground, which acts as a cold trap, preventing warm air from escaping. The result is a structure that looks delicate but is incredibly strong, a sanctuary carved from ice. Inside, families would gather to share meals and stories. They might eat roasted salmon, caught and smoked in the summer and stored in large quantities for the winter. The salmon, oily and rich, was often accompanied by cakes made from camas root, a bulb that was harvested in late spring and then roasted in underground pits for hours until it became sweet and caramelized, almost like a cross between a sweet potato and a pear. It was a delicacy, a treat that reminded people of the abundance that would return with the warmer months. They might also snack on dried seaweed, salty and slightly sweet, packed with minerals and energy. It's one of those foods that sounds strange until you try it, and then you wonder why it isn't more common. As the fire crackles softly and you sink deeper into your pillow, let me tell you about the concept of communal warmth. In many tribes, especially those in the coldest regions, survival was never an individual endeavor. It was collective. The heat from one fire warmed many people. The food from one hunt fed many families. The knowledge of one elder benefited the entire community. This wasn't just practical, it was deeply embedded in the social fabric. Generosity wasn't seen as a virtue to aspire to, it was simply the way things were done. If you had extra, you shared. If you needed help, you asked. There was no shame in either. This system worked because it was built on trust and reciprocity. If you helped someone today, you knew they would help you tomorrow. Not because of some formal contract, but because that's how the community functioned. In the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, this principle was formalized in the Great Law of Peace, a constitution that predates the United States Constitution by centuries. One of its core tenets was that decisions should be made with the welfare of the seventh generation in mind. Think about that for a moment. Not just your children or your grandchildren, but the people who would live 150 years in the future. That kind of long-term thinking requires patience, humility, and a deep respect for the continuity of life. You might find this little detail soothingly interesting. The insulating properties of animal furs were so effective that they became a form of currency and diplomacy. Beaver pelts, in particular, were highly prized by European traders when contact began in the 1600s. But for the tribes who had been using these furs for centuries, their value wasn't economic, it was existential. A well-made fur cloak could mean the difference between surviving a night in the open or freezing to death. The furs were carefully selected, prepared, and sewn together with sinew thread, creating garments that were both functional and beautiful. Some were decorated with quillwork or beadwork, intricate patterns that told stories or marked important events. As your breathing slows and your muscles relax, picture yourself wrapped in one of those fur cloaks. It's heavy, but the weight is comforting, like a deep hug. The fur is soft against your skin, and the warmth it provides is immediate and all-encompassing. You're sitting by a fire, watching the flames dance, listening to the wind outside. But the wind feels distant, almost like a memory. Inside you're safe. Inside you're home. And now, as your mind drifts, let the story carry you gently into the next chapter. Let me take you now into the heart of winter, when the land was blanketed in silence and the work of survival became both urgent and deliberate. Imagine yourself in the year 1600, somewhere on the Great Plains, where the horizon stretches endlessly and the sky feels impossibly vast. The snow is knee-deep in places, and the cold is sharp enough to make your eyes water. But you're not alone. You're part of a hunting party, moving quietly through the landscape, tracking a herd of bison that passed through days ago. The hunt is not just about finding food, it's about reading the land, understanding the animals, and working together with a precision that borders on the spiritual. The bison, massive and powerful, were the lifeblood of many plains tribes. They provided meat, hides, bones, sinew, everything needed for survival. But hunting them in winter required a different set of skills than hunting in summer. The deep snow slowed the bison down, but it also slowed the hunters. The cold made tracking easier because the prints remained clear and the animal's breath left visible clouds in the air. But the cold also made endurance a challenge. You couldn't afford to sweat, because sweat would freeze against your skin and sap your body heat. Every movement had to be calculated, every step deliberate. There's something comforting about this level of focus, the way the hunt demanded complete presence. You couldn't think about yesterday or tomorrow. You had to be here, now, reading the signs in front of you. A broken branch, a patch of flattened snow, a tuft of coarse fur caught on a thorn bush. Each clue told part of the story, and together they formed a map that only the most experienced hunters could read. The young men and women on their first winter hunt would watch the elders closely, learning not just through words but through observation, through imitation, through trial and error. Let me share with you what happened when the hunt was successful. The bison would be brought down with arrows or spears, sometimes driven into natural traps like ravines or snowdrifts where they couldn't escape. The kill was done with respect, with prayers and thanks offered to the animal's spirit. This wasn't sentimentality, it was acknowledgement. The hunters understood that they were taking a life, and that act carried weight. The meat would be butchered on the spot, the work divided among the party. The liver, rich and iron-heavy, was often eaten raw or lightly cooked right there in the field, a tradition that provided an immediate boost of energy and nutrients. It tasted metallic and earthy, almost primal, and it was considered a delicacy reserved for the hunters themselves. Back at the camp, the rest of the bison would be transformed. The meat was cut into strips and hung to dry, or it was slow roasted over open fires, filling the air with a smell that made everyone's mouth water. The fat was rendered and stored, precious fuel for cooking and warmth. The hides were scraped clean and stretched, beginning the long process of tanning. The bones were cracked open to extract the marrow, creamy and rich, often mixed with berries and herbs to make a kind of spread that could be eaten with dried bread or on its own. Bone marrow is one of those foods that feels deeply nourishing, almost like it's feeding not just your body but something deeper, something older. In the northern forests, where the Cree and Ojibwe peoples lived, winter hunting focused on smaller game like rabbits, deer, and moose. The snow made tracking easier, but it also made moving quietly more difficult. Hunters would wear snowshoes, wide frames woven with rawhide or sinew that distributed their weight and allowed them to walk on top of the snow instead of sinking into it. These snowshoes were works of art, each one custom-made to fit the wearer's stride and weight. The frames were steamed and bent into shape, then laced with intricate patterns that were both functional and beautiful. Let me tell you about a particular hunt that took place around the year 1550, as told by an elder many generations later. A young man, barely out of his teens, was on his first solo winter hunt. He had been tracking a moose for 2 days, following its trail through dense forest and across frozen streams. The moose was old and cunning, aware that it was being followed, and it led the young man on a winding path that tested his patience and skill. On the 3rd day, just as the sun was setting and the temperature was dropping dangerously low, the young man finally caught up to the moose. It stood in a clearing, its breath rising in great clouds, its eyes calm and knowing. The young man raised his bow, said a quiet prayer, and released the arrow. The shot was clean, and the moose fell quickly. But as the young man approached, he felt not triumph, but a profound sadness. He had taken a life, and with it came responsibility. He spent that night in the forest, building a small shelter and a fire, butchering the moose by the light of the flames. He ate sparingly, knowing he had to carry as much meat as possible back to the village. The next morning, he began the long walk home, the meat bundled on a sled made of branches and hide. It took him 2 more days, and by the time he arrived, he was exhausted. But the village welcomed him with songs and celebration. The meat was shared among all the families, and the young man was honored not for his skill, but for his perseverance and his respect for the animal. It's surprising how such a small moment, one hunt among thousands, became a story told for generations, a reminder of what it meant to be part of the community. In the Arctic, where the Inuit people lived, hunting in winter was even more extreme. The primary prey were seals, which had to be hunted on the sea ice in temperatures that could drop to 60 below zero. The process required extraordinary patience. A hunter would find a seal's breathing hole, a small opening in the ice where the seal would surface for air. Then he would stand absolutely still, sometimes for hours, waiting for the seal to appear. He couldn't move, couldn't make a sound, because the seal's hearing was acute. When the seal finally surfaced, the hunter would strike with a harpoon, a tool so finely crafted that it could pierce through blubber and bone in a single thrust. The seal, once caught, provided everything. The meat was eaten fresh or dried, the blubber was rendered into oil for lamps and cooking, the skin was used for clothing and boat coverings, and even the intestines were cleaned and used as waterproof containers. Nothing was wasted. This wasn't just practicality, it was reverence. The Inuit believed that the seal offered itself to the hunter, and in return, the hunter had to honor that gift by using every part. Let me tell you about a snack that might surprise you. In the depths of winter, when fresh food was scarce, Inuit families would sometimes eat muktuk, which is raw whale skin and blubber. It sounds unusual, I know, but it was actually quite delicious in its own way, chewy and slightly sweet, with a flavor that was rich and fatty. It was packed with vitamin C, which was crucial for preventing scurvy in a diet that had very few fruits or vegetables. The first European explorers who tried it were often repulsed, but that was because they didn't understand the context. For the Inuit, Muktuk was a delicacy, a connection to the ocean and the creatures that sustain them. As the fire burns low and your eyelids grow heavy, picture yourself back in that village, after the hunt, after the work is done. The meat is stored, the hides are drying, the tools are cleaned and put away. You're sitting with your family, eating a simple meal of dried fish and berries, sipping tea made from spruce needles that tastes faintly of the forest. Outside, the wind howls, but inside, you're warm and full and content. You've done your part. You've contributed. You belong. And now, let your thoughts drift softly into the next chapter. There's a certain kind of warmth that comes not from fire or fur, but from the human voice, from the stories that pass between generations like embers handed carefully from one set of hands to another. Tonight, let me take you into the long winter nights, when darkness stretched for 15, 16 hours, and the world outside was a frozen expanse of white and silence. Inside the lodges and longhouses, teepees and igloos, people gathered not just to survive, but to remember, to dream, to teach. The stories told in winter were different from those told in summer. They were longer, more layered, meant to be savored over many evenings. They were how knowledge traveled, how values were reinforced, how people understood who they were and where they came from. Imagine yourself in a Haudenosaunee longhouse around the year 1400, sitting with dozens of others in the flickering light of several fires. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke and roasting corn. Children are nestled against their parents, their eyes wide, waiting for the elderly to begin. The elder, a man whose face is lined with age and whose voice carries the weight of authority, starts to speak. He tells the story of the peacemaker, the figure who united the 5 nations and established the great law of peace. His voice is slow and rhythmic, almost hypnotic, and as he speaks, you can feel the room settling into a deep, collective stillness. The story goes like this. Long ago, the 5 nations were at war with one another, locked in cycles of violence and revenge. The land was soaked with blood, and the people lived in fear. Then came a man, born of a virgin mother, who carried a message of peace and unity. He traveled from village to village, teaching that the way to end the violence was to bury the weapons of war and to govern through consensus and cooperation. He was met with skepticism, even hostility, but he persisted. Eventually, with the help of a great orator named Hiawatha, he convinced the leaders of the 5 nations to come together and form a confederacy. The weapons were buried beneath a great white pine, the tree of peace, and its roots spread in the 4 directions, inviting other nations to join if they chose peace over war. There's something comforting about this story, the way it reminds us that peace is possible, that even the deepest conflicts can be resolved through dialogue and goodwill. The great law that emerged from this confederacy was complex and detailed, outlining systems of governance, methods for resolving disputes, and principles for maintaining balance and harmony. It was memorized, not written, and passed down orally, with designated keepers who were responsible for preserving its accuracy. This oral tradition required incredible mental discipline, the kind of focus and memory that seems almost impossible to us now in an age of instant information and external storage. Let me share with you another story, this one from the Lakota people of the Northern Plains, told around the year 1500. It's the story of White Buffalo Calf Woman, a sacred figure who appeared to the people during a time of great hardship. Two scouts were out hunting when they saw a beautiful woman approaching, dressed in white buckskin and carrying a bundle. One of the scouts had impure thoughts about her, and he was struck down on the spot, reduced to bones. The other scout, respectful and humble, was told to return to his village and prepare for her arrival. When she came, she taught the people 7 sacred ceremonies, including the pipe ceremony, which became central to Lakota spiritual life. She also brought the message that the buffalo would always provide for the people as long as they honored the animals and lived in harmony with the land. Then she walked away, and as she did, she transformed first into a black buffalo, then a brown buffalo, then a red buffalo, and finally into a white buffalo calf before disappearing over the horizon. This story, like so many others, is layered with meaning. On the surface, it's about respect and reverence, about the consequences of treating the sacred with disrespect. But deeper down, it's about the interconnectedness of all life, the idea that humans, animals, and the land are part of a single living whole. The white buffalo, exceedingly rare in nature, became a symbol of hope and renewal, a reminder that the sacred can appear in unexpected forms. In the Arctic, the Inuit told stories that were both entertaining and educational, often featuring a character named Raven, a trickster figure who was clever, mischievous, and sometimes foolish. In one story, Raven steals the sun, which had been hidden away by a greedy chief, and releases it into the sky, bringing light to the world. In another, Raven tries to trick a group of seals but ends up getting caught in his own trap. These stories were funny, full of twists and turns that made people laugh, but they also taught important lessons about humility, resourcefulness, and the dangers of greed. Children learned from Raven's mistakes without feeling lectured or judged. The lessons sank in naturally, almost invisibly, woven into the fabric of the story itself. You might find this little detail soothingly interesting. The act of storytelling was itself a form of survival. In the long, dark winters, when depression and cabin fever could set in, stories provided mental stimulation, emotional connection, and a sense of continuity. They reminded people that they were part of something larger than themselves, part of a lineage that stretched back hundreds, even thousands of years. The stories weren't just entertainment, they were medicine for the soul. Let me tell you about a sweet treat that often accompanied these storytelling sessions. Among the Anishinaabe people, maple sugar was a precious commodity, harvested in early spring when the sap began to flow. The sap was collected in birch bark containers and boiled down over open fires until it thickened into syrup or crystallized into sugar. This sugar, stored carefully, would last through the winter and be brought out on special occasions. A small piece of maple sugar, dissolving slowly on the tongue, was pure sweetness, a reminder of the warmth and abundance that would return with the changing seasons. It tasted like sunshine and hope, like the promise that winter, no matter how long, would eventually end. In the southwestern pueblos, storytelling often took place in the kivas, underground ceremonial chambers that were warm and intimate. The stories told there were sacred, meant only for those who had been initiated into certain societies or clans. These weren't casual tales. They were teachings about the origins of the world, the relationships between humans and the spirit beings, the proper ways to conduct ceremonies and rituals. The details of these stories were guarded closely, shared only within the community, because they contained knowledge that was considered powerful and sacred. To share them carelessly would be to diminish their potency, to disrespect the ancestors who had entrusted them to the living. As the fire crackles softly and you feel your body sinking deeper into relaxation, picture yourself in one of these sacred spaces. The air is warm and still, scented faintly with sage and cedar. The walls are smooth adobe, painted with symbols that have meanings you're only beginning to understand. An elder is speaking, her voice low and measured, telling a story about Spider-Woman, who taught the people how to weave. As she speaks, a young woman in the corner is working at a loom, her hands moving in a rhythm that echoes the cadence of the story. The thread she's weaving is dyed in shades of red and black and white, colors that hold significance, that tell their own story within the larger pattern. You watch her hands, mesmerized by the repetition, the way each thread finds its place, the way chaos becomes order, becomes beauty. There's a savory snack that might have been passed around during these gatherings, something called pinyon cakes, made from ground pine nuts mixed with corn flour and baked on hot stones. The cakes were dense and nutty, with a subtle sweetness from the corn, and they were filling in a way that made you feel grounded and satisfied. They were simple, but simplicity can be its own kind of perfection. The stories, the food, the warmth, all of it worked together to create a sense of belonging, a sense that no matter how harsh the world outside, inside there was community, there was love, there was continuity. And that, perhaps more than any physical shelter or stored food, was what allowed people to accept winter not as an enemy, but as a teacher. And now, let your mind float gently into the next chapter. There's a quietness that comes with deep winter, a kind of hush that settles over the world and invites us to turn inward. Tonight, let me take you into the spiritual dimensions of the season, the ways that Native American tribes understood winter not just as a physical challenge, but as a time of profound spiritual significance. Imagine yourself in the year 1650, in a small village nestled at the base of a mountain range, somewhere in what we now call Montana. The snow is deep, the sky is a pale, endless gray, and the world feels suspended, as if time itself has slowed to a crawl. This is the season when the veil between the physical and spiritual worlds grows thin, when dreams carry weight, when visions are sought and sometimes granted. For many tribes, winter was a time for vision quests, particularly for young men and women coming of age. These were not casual undertakings. A vision quest required preparation, both physical and mental. The seeker would fast for days, purifying their body and mind, shedding the distractions of everyday life. Then they would go out alone into the wilderness, often to a high place, a mountaintop or a remote cliff, where they would sit in solitude, exposed to the elements, waiting for a vision to come. In summer, this was challenging. In winter, it was a test of endurance that pushed the seeker to the very edge of survival. Let me share with you what this might have felt like. Imagine you're the seeker. You've been fasting for 3 days. Your body is weak, your mind is floating, untethered. You're sitting on a rocky outcrop, wrapped in a single blanket, the wind cutting through you like a blade. The cold is almost unbearable, but you've been taught to endure, to see the cold not as pain but as a teacher, as something that strips away the unnecessary and reveals what's essential. You're waiting for a sign, a dream, a message from the spirits. Hours pass, maybe days. You lose track. And then, in the liminal space between waking and sleeping, you see something. It might be an animal, a bear, or an eagle, or a wolf. It might be an ancestor, their face familiar yet distant. It might be a voice, speaking words you don't fully understand but feel in your bones. This is your vision, your gift from the spirit world, and it will guide you for the rest of your life. These visions were not interpreted lightly. The seeker would return to the village and speak with the elders, who would help them understand the meaning and significance of what they had seen. The vision might reveal the seeker's purpose, their role within the community. It might grant them a name, a song, a symbol that would become their identity. It might also carry warnings or responsibilities, lessons about humility or caution. The process was deeply personal, but it was also communal, because the visions were understood to benefit not just the individual, but the entire tribe. There's something comforting about this relationship between the individual and the collective, the way personal growth and community well-being were seen as inseparable. In the Lakota tradition, there was a ceremony called the Inapi, the sweat lodge, which was often performed in winter. The lodge was a small, dome-shaped structure covered with hides or blankets, dark and enclosed. Inside, heated stones were placed in a pit, and water was poured over them to create steam. The heat was intense, almost suffocating, and the participants would sit for hours, praying, singing, and purifying themselves. The sweat lodge was seen as a return to the womb of Mother Earth, a place of rebirth and renewal. When the ceremony was complete, the participants would emerge into the cold winter air, their skin steaming, their spirits cleansed. The contrast between the heat of the lodge and the cold of the outside world was jarring, but it was also invigorating, a reminder of the body's resilience and the spirit's capacity for transformation. Let me tell you about a food that was often consumed after these ceremonies, a kind of ceremonial soup made from corn, beans, and squash, the 3 sisters that were sacred to many tribes. The soup was simple but deeply nourishing, the flavors blending together in a way that felt harmonious and balanced. The corn was sweet, the beans were earthy, and the squash added a subtle richness. It was the kind of meal that made you feel grounded, connected to the earth and to the people around you. In some traditions, a small amount of dried buffalo meat would be added, giving the soup a smoky depth that made it feel complete. In the Arctic, the Inuit had their own spiritual practices tied to winter. The shaman, or Angakik, was a figure of great power and respect, someone who could communicate with the spirit world and intervene on behalf of the community. In winter, when the darkness was deepest and the cold most severe, the shaman's role became especially important. They would perform ceremonies to ensure good hunting, to heal the sick, to protect the village from malevolent spirits. These ceremonies often involved drumming, chanting, and trance states, the shaman journeying into the spirit world while their body remained in the physical realm. The drum, made from a wooden frame and stretched caribou hide, had a deep, resonant sound that seemed to echo in the chest, in the bones. It was the heartbeat of the ceremony, the rhythm that guided the shaman's journey. You might find this little detail soothingly interesting. The Inuit believed that animals had souls, just as humans did, and that these souls had to be honored and respected. After a seal was killed, for example, the hunter would offer it a drink of fresh water, acknowledging its sacrifice and ensuring that its soul would return to the sea and be reborn. This wasn't superstition. It was a deeply held belief that the balance between humans and animals was maintained through reciprocity and respect. If a hunter was greedy or wasteful, the animals would know, and they would stop offering themselves. The consequences were not abstract, they were immediate and tangible. A failed hunt meant hunger, and hunger in winter meant death. In the southwestern pueblos, winter was marked by ceremonies that honored the Kachinas, spirit beings who served as intermediaries between humans and the divine. These ceremonies involved elaborate dances, masks, and costumes, each one representing a specific Kachina with specific powers and responsibilities. The dances were not performances in the way we might think of them, they were rituals, acts of prayer and supplication. The dancers embodied the Kachinas, becoming vessels for their presence. Watching these dances, you would feel the air shift, the energy intensify, as if the boundary between the seen and unseen worlds had dissolved. Let me tell you about an unusual snack that was sometimes prepared for these ceremonies. Piki bread, made from blue cornmeal mixed with water and ash, was spread thin on a hot stone and cooked until it became crispy and paper-thin. It had a slightly smoky, mineral flavor from the ash, and a delicate texture that dissolved on the tongue. Piki bread was labor-intensive to make, requiring skill and patience, and it was often prepared by the women of the village as an offering to the Kachinas. It was a food that carried spiritual significance, a tangible expression of gratitude and devotion. As the fire burns low and your breathing slows, picture yourself in one of these winter ceremonies. The room is filled with people, their faces lit by firelight, their voices joining together in song. The sound is powerful, not loud but deep, vibrating in your chest, making you feel part of something larger than yourself. Outside, the wind howls, but inside, there's a sense of peace, of alignment, of being exactly where you're meant to be. The cold is still there, just beyond the walls, but it doesn't feel threatening. It feels natural, part of the cycle, part of the rhythm of life that includes birth and death, growth and rest, action and stillness. And now, as your body relaxes completely, let the story carry you gently into the next chapter. There's a moment deep in the heart of winter when the light begins to shift. It's subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but if you're paying attention, you can feel it. The days grow a few minutes longer. The angle of the sun changes, casting shadows in new directions. The air, though still cold, carries a different quality, a hint of something softer, something waiting just beneath the surface. Tonight, let me take you into this threshold time, the late winter days when the harshest cold has passed and the promise of spring is beginning to whisper through the land. This is the season when Native American tribes understood that their acceptance of winter had been rewarded, that their patience and resilience had carried them through, and that the cycle was turning once again. Imagine yourself in the year 1700, in a village on the edge of the Great Lakes. The snow is still deep, but it's beginning to change. During the day, the sun is strong enough to create a crust on the surface, and at night, the crust freezes hard. This is the time when maple sap begins to flow, a sure sign that winter is loosening its grip. For the Anishinaabe people, this was a time of celebration and hard work. The maple trees, their trunks thick and their bark rough, were tapped with small wooden spouts, and the sap was collected in birch bark containers. The sap itself was thin and slightly sweet, almost like water with a hint of sugar. But when boiled down over open fires, stirring constantly to prevent burning, it transformed into syrup, thick and golden and impossibly delicious. Let me share with you what it was like to be part of a sugar camp. Families would move out to the maple groves, setting up temporary shelters near the trees. The work was communal, everyone contributing. Children would help collect the sap, carrying the containers carefully so as not to spill. Women tended the fires, stirring the syrup, testing its consistency by drizzling it onto the snow, where it would harden into candy. Men carved new spouts and repaired the containers. The air was filled with the smell of wood smoke and boiling sap, a scent that was both earthy and sweet, grounding and uplifting at the same time. At night, exhausted from the day's work, families would gather around the fires, eating stew and fresh maple candy, telling stories and laughing, their faces glowing in the firelight. The maple sugar wasn't just a treat, it was a vital source of calories and energy as winter stores ran low. It was also a form of wealth, something that could be traded or given as a gift. A block of maple sugar, wrapped in birch bark, was a symbol of generosity and prosperity. And the act of making it, the long hours of labor, the cooperation and patience required, was itself a teaching, a reminder that good things take time, that sweetness is earned through effort. In the northern plains, late winter was the time when the buffalo herds began to move, migrating toward their calving grounds. The tribes would follow, breaking camp and traveling despite the lingering cold and snow. This was a time of anticipation, of knowing that the lean months were almost over, that abundance was on the horizon. The journey was difficult, but it was also hopeful. Children who had been born the previous spring were now walking on their own, experiencing the migration for the first time. Elders who had survived another winter carried themselves with quiet pride, their presence a reassurance to the younger generations that life goes on, that the cycle continues. Let me tell you about a savory dish that was often prepared during this time, a kind of stew made from dried meat, wild onions, and early spring greens. The greens, shoots of plants that were just beginning to emerge from the snow, were tender and slightly bitter, a refreshing contrast to the heavy, rich foods of winter. They provided vitamins that had been scarce in the winter diet, helping to ward off scurvy and restore energy. The stew was simple, but it tasted like renewal, like the earth coming back to life. There's something comforting about that first taste of fresh greens after months of dried and preserved foods, a reminder that nature provides, that the cycle is trustworthy. In the Arctic, Late winter was marked by the return of the sun. After months of darkness, the sun would finally rise above the horizon, its light weak but undeniable. The Inuit would gather to celebrate, singing and dancing, welcoming the sun back like an old friend. This wasn't just symbolic. The return of the sun meant warmer temperatures, the melting of the sea ice, and the return of the migratory animals that had been absent during the darkest months. It meant survival was assured for another year. There's a particular snack that was enjoyed during this time, something called akutak, also known as Eskimo ice cream. It was made from whipped fat, usually from seals or caribou, mixed with berries and sometimes fish. It sounds unusual, and it is, but it's also surprisingly delicious, creamy and rich with a slight tang from the berries. Akutak was traditionally made in celebration, a way of marking the transition from the scarcity of winter to the abundance of spring. It was a food that brought people together, that was shared freely and eaten with joy. You might find this little detail soothingly interesting. The concept of the circle was central to many Native American spiritual traditions. Life was not seen as a straight line, with a beginning and an end, but as a circle endlessly turning. Winter gave way to spring, which gave way to summer, which gave way to fall, which gave way to winter again. Birth, growth, death, and rebirth were all part of the same cycle, each stage necessary, each stage sacred. This understanding made winter not something to be feared or resented, but something to be accepted as part of the natural rhythm of existence. In the Haudenosaunee tradition, the new year began in late winter with a ceremony called the Midwinter Festival, or the New Year Festival. This was a time of renewal and reconciliation, when disputes were settled, debts were forgiven, and people started fresh. The ceremony lasted several days and included dances, feasts, and the giving of thanks. One of the most important elements was the stirring of the ashes, a symbolic act that represented the rekindling of the sacred fire, the renewal of life and energy. The ashes from the old year's fires were stirred and new fires were lit, their flames bright and warm, a promise that life would continue. Let me tell you about a sweet delicacy that was prepared for this festival. Cornbread cakes, made from white corn flour and sweetened with maple sugar, were baked in clay ovens or on hot stones. They were soft and slightly crumbly, with a sweetness that was gentle rather than overwhelming. Each bite felt like a blessing, a taste of the abundance that was to come. These cakes were shared among families, a way of strengthening bonds and expressing gratitude. As the fire crackles one last time and you feel yourself drifting towards sleep, picture yourself standing at the edge of a forest in late winter. The sun is setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The snow is beginning to melt, and you can hear the faint sound of water trickling beneath the ice. The air is still cold, but it doesn't bite the way it did a month ago. It's softer now, gentler. You take a deep breath, and you can smell it, the promise of spring, the scent of earth and green things waiting to emerge. You think about the months that have passed, the challenges and the quiet victories, the way the community pulled together, the way the stories kept you warm. You think about the hunts, the ceremonies, the long nights by the fire. And you realize that you've changed. You've learned something that can't be taught with words, only with experience. You've learned to accept what you cannot change, to work with the rhythms of nature rather than against them, to find peace in stillness and strength in patience. Winter was never the enemy. It was a teacher, a companion, a sacred part of the cycle. And as you stand there, watching the light fade and the first stars appear, you feel a deep sense of gratitude. Not for the hardship itself, but for what it revealed, for the resilience it uncovered, for the connections it deepened. You're ready for spring, yes, but you're also grateful for winter. You're grateful for the silence, the slowness, the chance to turn inward and discover what was always there, waiting to be found. The circle is complete. The cycle continues. And you are part of it, woven into the fabric of something ancient and enduring and profoundly beautiful. Thank you for traveling through this gentle piece of history with me. I hope you found peace in the stories, warmth in the details, and perhaps a new appreciation for the wisdom of those who came before us, who understood that acceptance is not surrender, but a kind of profound strength. If you drifted into peaceful sleep, let me know in the comments below. And if you're still awake, well, maybe that means the story wasn't quite boring enough. Either way, I'm grateful you were here. Sweet dreams, my friends. Until the next time we meet in the quiet hours of the night, may you find rest, and may you always remember that winter, like all seasons, has something to teach us if we're willing to listen. Sleep well.